Hi. So, we're entering a discussion on race and ethnicity as we move along in talking about inequality and stratification. And I have split this discussion into two modules or 2 weeks of content. So, for the first module or week, we're going to be looking at racial and ethnic and minority groups, as well as prejudice, discrimination, and racism. Next week's module will focus primarily on theoretical perspectives of race and ethnicity, intergroup relationships, and race and ethnicity in the United States. Let's get started. So let's start by looking at definitions of the term race. A race refers to a group that is set apart from others based on something called a phenotype. Phenotypes are basically observable physical traits, um, thinking of things like skin color, hair texture, nose shape, eye shape, these physical features that are used to categorize people. And while these groups have social significance, I have to point out that they don't really have real differences between them otherwise. So, for example, when it comes to genotype or a person's genetic makeup, people of varying races share 99.9% of the same DNA, and less than 0.1% of all of the, or 0.01% of all of the DNA in your body accounts for physical differences between racial backgrounds. So basically, race does not exist genetically, but that has never stopped people from trying to find genetic explanations for race. So when we talk about race, it's not really constructed biologically. It's based on social construction, which refers to the process by which racial groups develop beyond physical characteristics and looking at some specific factors. So, for example, historical factors, cultural, power, and economic factors, and the justifications that are used to support those. Racial categorizations also are um, not static, they are dynamic and they change from culture to culture and across time. So the racial categorizations that we see today have actually evolved. I don't know if that's the right term to use, but they have changed, compared to the previous racial terms and categorizations that were used. When it comes to ethnicity, this is different from race because it's based on shared cultural elements. And it's not really a synonym for national origin, although sometimes we use it in that way, because sometimes it is, actually. But the two terms we define as being separate, and while they can overlap, they are two separate things. When it comes to ethnicity, there is a shared sense of identity, a shared sense of belonging. And then there can also be symbolic ethnicity, where there's more superficial expressions of ethnicity, like looking at things like food, music, clothing, and other things like that. So, this first video of the module is going to look at racial, ethnic, and minority groups and discuss the differences between racial groups and ethnic groups, or race and ethnicity, and some of the constructions and definitions and contexts of these terms. And then looking at potential problems using the terms minority and majority, and what alternatives there are for those terms. So, going back into that social construction of race and some of those justifications, historically, we've seen a lot of justification based in either pseudoscience or in religion. So, with pseudoscience, this means trying to come up with some sort of scientific um, explanation for racial categorizations, like talking about genotype, for example. Um, or using what's called scientific racism. The example in your text looks at Blumenbach's 5 races, and those were based on a scientific explanation of race looking at geographic locations. So this might be one of the earliest connections between race and ethnicity through the lens of national origin. Although, remember, ethnicity and nationality do not go hand in hand all the time. They're not synonymous. Another type of scientific racism was phrenology, which was actually had quite a following, even though it's probably one of the dumbest sounding sciences you might ever encounter. Phrenology is the study of the skull and the head shape and size, and the brain and things like that. Even looking for like bumps and like surface area characteristics of the skull, and using that information to come up with some determination of inferiority um, or superiority of a group of people. Another practice is eugenics, also known as being well born, and it has a really dark, dark history, not just in the US, but globally. Eugenics has been used basically in order to try to create a superior race through oftentimes ethnic cleansing or forced sterilization, or more often through more subtle methods, like through family planning practices and things like that. So eugenics is kind of like this. I guess it's the use of ideas about the survival of the fittest, but from a social perspective, in order to kind of eliminate what is seen as being the weaker races of a people. And then we have things that aren't really far from eugenics, like looking at IQ through the famous study of the bell curve, which basically set out to do these IQ tests in order to prove that racial minorities, and primarily Black people, were inferior when it came to intelligence. Um, all of these practices have been debunked. The bell curve, for example, it's been really obvious to see that the tests themselves were biased, that they were racist, and they were measuring something that can't be measured based on skin color alone, but more so could be influenced by one's social environment and their education and resources. Some of the religious explanations, there are several, but two of the ones that stand out for me are polygenesis, which is this view that these races have different beginnings or different creations and creation stories, and that we're not actually related. And then curse theory, which basically says that a particular proportion of or people have been cursed by God, and so they have been made to be inferior. And the Bible, the Christian Bible, has been used to support this for enslavement in the U.S., for example, um, and saying that there's the curse of the children of Ham, uh, and that those people or that people should be forced to have a master and be enslaved and kind of walk the earth in despair as like second class citizens. So yeah, there's been a lot of effort that's gone into trying to create this construction of race. Another concept that we can look at is scapegoat theory, which was developed initially from Dollard's frustration aggression theory. And this theory suggests that a dominant group will displace its unfocused aggression, right? So, whatever anger, whether it's valid or not, that they will displace that aggression onto a subordinate group. If they can't find anywhere specific to direct it or anywhere that seems meaningful to direct it, they may just direct it to a racial group or an ethnic group, a subordinate group. So, for a long time, it's been perfectly acceptable to use the terms minority and majority when describing um, racial and ethnic group relations. And more recently, we've kind of moved away from that because the terms are a bit misleading. People often think that majority is being used in the numeric sense, and they believe that once a group has grown, or as a group grows to take up more and more of the population, that means that the group will no longer be a minority. And that's not quite how it works. It has nothing to do with numbers, really. What we're looking at here is the proportion of power, right? And so minority groups are those groups that have a minority of the power, and majority groups are those that have a majority amount of power. And so you can be a very tiny minority group, and or sorry, numerical minority, and still have a large amount of power. For one example, again, I lived in the UAE, and the people of the UAE, or the native local people of the UAE, or the Emiratis, maintain the majority of power there, despite the fact that they only make up between 10 to 20% of the population. So yeah, power has nothing to do with numbers when it comes to race and ethnicity. So the terms that we use most often would be subordinate, which is kind of like a synonym for minority in this case, or dominant, which would be a synonym for majority. And here we have some of the characteristics of both minority slash subordinate groups. One is that they experience unequal treatment, that they may have unequal access to opportunities, or they may experience prejudice or discrimination. Another is that they might have a shared phenotype. And so, because they have similar characteristics in some way, then their membership is basically based on that. There's a scribe status, meaning that your membership is involuntary, and that you really typically can't avoid being a member of one of these groups because of that phenotype kind of giving away your status. Another is solidarity, meaning that there's this in group, out group dynamic, um, or an us versus them kind of dynamic. And then finally, there's endogamy, meaning that there's in group marriage. People also pronounce it as endogamy. Either way, usually I say endogamy, but I got caught off guard, I guess, this time. But particularly, this is just like alluding to the fact that minority and subordinate group members are more likely to marry within their own group.